Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the first part of Chapter 16, which is about the autonomic nervous system. But before I do that, I'm going to do a review over the nervous system in general, because if you don't understand the nervous system, it'd be hard to understand an aspect of the nervous system. So up here we have the nervous system, which is broken up into two main parts. You have the central nervous system, which is the CNS, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And you have the PNS, which stands for Peripheral Nervous System, which is basically everything else. So you have the CNS, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the Peripheral Nervous System, which is the rest of the body, basically. So the Peripheral nervous system, the PNS, is split up into two subdivisions, which means there are two things that make up the PNS. Well, if you think about it logically, this is the nervous system, which is having to do with neurons. So basically, your neurons can do two things. The first thing it can do, it can tell you to go voluntarily pick something up and move it. So this is motor. Or your neurons can sense things. So I'm touching this, and information about how it feels is going to synapse in my brain. So the two subdivisions of the PNS would then be sensory, which includes like hearing, smelling, tasting, touch, and all of that, and also motor. Now, motor also has two subdivisions, because if you think about it, there are two different ways your body can move. You can either do it voluntarily or involuntarily. Like, for example, I am voluntarily squeezing my hand, but I am involuntarily having my heart beat. I don't consciously control that. I also don't consciously control things like digestion and other things of that nature. So you're going to have somatic, which is the voluntary aspect of movement, which basically goes to the skeletal muscles. So like your biceps, triceps, all those different muscles involved with voluntary motions. Then the other aspect is autonomic. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic. Autonomic, automatic. So this one has to do with more of the involuntary aspects of motor. So this one would include things like your heartbeat, your blood pressure, things in your internal organs that you don't really control. So I'm going to put that there. It says organs. Now you have two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. You have, well, technically three. So I'll have one squiggly one over here, which is like sort of. You have the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic. You have the sympathetic. And you have the enteric. The enteric has to do with digestion. Now, the reason why enteric sort of belongs under autonomic, but not exactly, is because the enteric nervous system has both sensory and motor neurons. So sensory and motor neurons. Now, the reason why this is significant is because if you notice, the PNS is split into motor and sensory. So sensory is over here, and the rest of this stuff all has to do with motor. So autonomic, which is what enteric is a subdivision of, also has to do with motor. But the fact that it has sensory and motor neurons kind of sets it apart, so it doesn't quite exactly fit 100%. But the reason why they put enteric under autonomic is because enteric, which is digestion, is a involuntary process that happens without conscious control. Now, conscious control would be like your brain, telling you that you need to start digesting. However, the CNS can override the enteric nervous system at times. Like, for example, if you had just eaten a big meal and you're digesting your food, and then all of a sudden you go run a mile, your brain is going to tell your enteric nervous system that it needs to wait. So it's going to send all the blood that would normally be going to your stomach to digest, and it would send it instead to the muscles that you're using right now to be running and all those different things. So the brain can override the enteric, but the enteric system does not depend upon the CNS in order to function. your enteric nervous system can function completely fine by itself without any help from the central nervous system. Back to these two, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Sympathetic has to do with exercise and fight or flight. Fight or flight is basically if you're put in a stressful situation, your body is going to do certain things in order to prepare you to run away. Like your heart rate's going to speed up, your pupils are going to dilate in order to see your surroundings better, all sorts of different things. And the parasympathetic has to do with rest. So, yeah, those are the two types of involuntary reactions you can have. Like, for example, when you're at rest, your parasympathetic is going to have your heart rate calm down involuntarily, and when you're exercising, your sympathetic nervous system is going to be having your heart rate speed up, but you're not consciously controlling that. That is done by your autonomic nervous system. Now, something else to make a vocabulary term that is important to know is that the sensory is sometimes referred to the afferent, is referred to afferent, and motor is sometimes referred to as efferent. Now, this might not make sense unless you understand what it is referring to. These two terms are referring to, in regards to the brain. So, for example, motor, your brain first has to tell your muscles what to do before it can happen. So the information is going from your brain to your muscle. So, in reality, the information is going from your brain, exiting the brain, and going to the muscle. So we have E for exit the CNS. And then we have sensory. When you touch something and feel it, the information is going from your fingers and your receptors all the way up to your brain so you can interpret that information. So we have A for approaches CNS. Because efferent and afferent both sound very similar. So this is a little way to remember it. A for approaches and E for exit. And that's basically that for the review of the nervous system. So let's take a good look at the whole thing all together before we move on. So we have the CNS, the PNS, which splits into the motor and sensory, which splits into basically voluntary and involuntary types of motor. Then we have basically things at rest, exercise, and digestion. So now let's move on to a different topic, which we're going to be comparing the sympathetic, or not the sympathetic, I'm sorry, comparing the somatic to the autonomic, because this chapter is mostly about the autonomic system. So we're going to be comparing these two and how they're different. So in order to understand better, I'm going to kind of draw a little diagram. So this is a person, that's their head, their neck. This isn't, supposed to be the best drawing in the world, so just bear with me. I'm trying to hold the camera and draw at the same time. Alright, so this is their arm. This is their brain. This is the brain stem coming down into the spine. Yes, this is the spine. Okay, so in the book it says, in the somatic nervous system, the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons are in the CNS, and their axons extend from there to skeletal muscle. So what does that look like? So you have the neuron cell bodies are in the CNS, in the brain. And just a quick recap of what a neuron cell body is, and I'm going to draw a little picture of a neuron real quick. So here's your neuron. Here's the dendrites. Dendrites. Then you have the axon. And then you have the presynaptic terminals at the end. And then you have the myelin sheath covering the axon. So this is the neuron cell body. And this is the axon. So, like the book said, in the somatic nervous system, the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons are in the CNS. So these are the cell bodies of the neuron. And the axons are going to extend down. I'm going to use a different color so you can see better. the axons are going to extend down. It's yellow. And then they're going to exit directly onto the muscles. So here's your, let's say your bicep. Okay, here's your bicep muscle. Ooh, it's striated. Yeah. So your axon is going to go directly to the muscle. I don't know if you guys remember about the neuromuscular junction from chapter 9. It looks like this. You have, this is hard. You have the axon here. This is representing the axon. So this thing is representing this axon coming down. Then this would be basically the muscle. So this is representing where it's touching the muscle right there. So muscle. And this is called the synapse. So this is called the neuromuscular junction. I'm just going to put NMJ. The neuromuscular junction, because it stands for neuron and muscle, and junction is just where two things come together. So this is the somatic. I'm going to make sure to put that down so you don't get confused. This is somatic, which is the voluntary, which goes directly to skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles. So as you can see, the axons and the neurons go directly to the muscle, so it has only one synapse here. The synapse being right there, which is right here where the transfer of neurotransmitters happens. Now, if you remember what happens at the synapse, you have here, it's called the presynaptic terminal. Presynaptic terminal. And this one is called the postsynaptic terminal. And that just means before and after the synapse. And so, I remember in chapter 9, the example they used was acetylcholine. Acetylcholine was in these vesicles, and the acetylcholine dye fused across the synapse into the muscle to cause the muscle to contract, or basically to cause an action potential for something to happen. So, in this case, the acetylcholine was stimulating the muscle to contract, or to do something. So that's an example of exciting or stimulating the muscle. And that happens with every case with voluntary movements in the skeletal muscle. So we can say that in the somatic nervous system, all the things that are going to happen are going to be excitatory. Another word for that is stimulatory. Because what's going to be happening at the synapses is exciting or stimulating something to happen. This is important because this directly contrasts with the autonomic nervous system, which can either excite or stimulate. Like the example I used earlier with the autonomic system here, there's parasympathetic and sympathetic. So for example, your heart, it can inhibit the heart rate and make it slow down at rest, which is an inhibitory, or it can speed it up and make it beat faster, which is stimulating it or exciting it during exercise. Autonomic system, on the other hand, I had this one pre-drawn, so I have to draw it again. The autonomic system, on the other hand, is a little bit different than the somatic. You have the same guy, same whatever, but the neuron cell bodies, remember these, are going to be located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And like I said, in somatic, it has one synapse because it goes directly to the muscle. That's not the case with the autonomic. In the book, it shows you a picture of it. So you see how the axon's going down. Here's the head, supposedly, and the axon's going down the spinal cord, and it exits and goes directly to the muscle. That is somatic, voluntary, with skeletal muscle. Autonomic, on the other hand, starts in the brain or whatever, and comes down, and it doesn't go directly to where it's going. It has to make a pit stop first. It makes a stop at something called an autonomic ganglion, which is here, where the neuron actually stops and synapses with another neuron. So this little red dot is actually symbolizing the neuron cell body of a new neuron. And then this neuron's going to go to the organ that it needs to go to, like the digestive system or the lungs or the heart or whatever it is. So you call this the pre-ganglionic neuron. See that? Because it happens, this is the neuron before the ganglion. Then you have the post-ganglionic neuron, which happens after the ganglion. So that's one of the differences between autonomic and somatic, is that the somatic system only has one synapse, whereas the autonomic system has two. Which is also kind of, you can think of it as the somatic system is faster. Like, for example, when you're playing sports, you need to have really quick reflexes. When you basically tell yourself to, like, kick the ball, it happens right away because there's only one synapse. Whereas with, like, digestion is rather slow, and they have 2 pit stops it needs to make. So it's kind of like when you're in an airplane and you have a layover. It takes time. So digestion is slower. So this is one of the reasons why. Here's a quick question for you all. Do the axons of the autonomic and somatic system go through the dorsal or the ventral root of the spine or the spinal cord? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I will show you. Here's a picture of the spinal cord, and here is the roots that make up the spinal nerve when they come together. This one is the dorsal root, and this one is the ventral root. I'll write that down. So this is dorsal. This one's ventral. Now, what does that mean? Well, the dorsal root has to do with sensory, and the ventral root has to do with motor. How do you remember that? Well, the ganglion. I remember this by 2 ways. One, because this looks like an arm. This could be like a little muscle. And this is called the ganglion here. And gangs often have muscles to beat people up. Or you can choose to think of this as looking like an eye, which is part of the senses. So the dorsal root deals with senses, and the ventral root deals with motor. So back to my question, I said, does the autonomic and somatic system go through the ventral or the dorsal root? Well, the autonomic and the somatic both are branches of the motor system. So logically, it would travel through the ventral motor root. Don't get that mixed up. I'm going to talk about is where you can find the cell bodies of the sympathetic, which is here, and where you can find the cell bodies of the parasympathetic neurons. So I drew a little picture. You know how the spine is split up into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral? Well, from T1 to L2 is where you find the sympathetic cell bodies. The cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system. So they're all going to be in the gray matter. So this is like a part of your spine. So if you took this portion of your spine out, that's what it would look like. So you're going to find the cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system in this portion. And from S2 to S4, which is the sacral part, is where you're going to find the cell bodies of the parasympathetic nervous system. That's all I have for you now. If you have any more specific questions, leave a comment and I will try to get back to you and answer you.